anxious. I'm never anxious. I've never been anxious in my life. In my life. Not me. Not me. So I had this idea that I was gonna talk about invisible identity and marginalization, because I've had a lot of like marginalization labels in the past, but a lot of them, especially the way I live my life now, are what we would call like invisible, right? Like being white passing, living in a middle class neighborhood. My sexuality and my mental health struggles are not something I have to disclose to somebody. And so even as they present as like disability or learning disability, that's not something that someone makes a judgment about me when they meet me. And the same thing with my sexuality, and the same thing with my race, and the same thing with my like low income background. Like none of those things are things that people judge me with when they meet me, but they're experiences that I identify with, and they help me relate to my students just because I'm an empathetic person, but also in a concrete way. Like I understand what it's like to go through the process of like getting healthcare services for yourself, that sort of thing. So I was freaking out. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I did the video project, and I decided I'm just going to do that again, kind of. Like I'm going to just have, like one of the principles we talked about in class was this idea of like kitchen table theory making, which is a way of, rather than using things like hard data, learning to value more informal methods of
the data you gain
out of conversating and like more organic forms of like developing ideas together. So it's a big thing in like Chicana feminist theory and in critical race theory to use like testimonio and other like forms of like narrative as your research. So I'm doing a lot of like me talking to the camera, and me like I'm pulling audio from the interview I did with Rachel and from the interviews I've already done with you guys, to like build that same conversation in a different way.
Nice. Mm-hmm. It sounds kind of like the self-portrait, but in a video format.
Right. I also wrote a bit about Dad.
How kick-ass I am.
Some.
It's not that.
I was reading about it's really big in Chicana feminist theory, this idea of like of narrative being valued, especially when you're not valued in other places, in academia. And everything I was reading, I was like, oh, that's like Dad, but he would hate that it's from the Chicana feminine out of the whole class.
He would agree with that if he didn't know where it came from.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what I was like, it's like my dad would never accept that label, but he's the king of testimonial kitchen table theory making. You're the best at it.
It's funny.
It's because you're brown.
How?
My dad rejects the title of Latine vehemently, and yet he engages in these informal ways of knowing, this kitchen table theory making. He invites scholars from all across the lands, young poets, poor neighbors, rich aunts, academics, and fools, children. They sit at his table, and he leans back against the countertops. He moves them to yell and laugh and cry and talk and eat and get drunk in ways which make meaning and connection. This is weird. You know that, right?
Why?
I say that because I think it's easy to undervalue it. Like I think that like the way that you and I talk to each other has kind of become habit for us, and I know that we value it, like we get excited to see each other and we get excited to do it, but I think that there's another level of valuing it, which is like not everyone gets to have this kind of relationship.
I value it most than anything. It's my favorite thing to do is have serious conversations. I never get to have them. and I like him the most. And so what I'll do is, like, my favorite spiritual writer right now, Eckhart Tolle, is all about constant meditation, being present and meditating,
even when you're doing stuff.
yes, so that you're conscious and deliberate of all the decisions you make, and everything that's presented in front of you, you look at, not bringing your entire past to that one moment, but instead of just experiencing the one moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I have the luxury, as out of work COVID artist, to lay in bed and think about what I think about things. It's my favorite thing to do, is try to figure out things in life with people that it matters.
Sister, is that your brother in the straight jacket, drinking tea, playing the piano?
I just pulled up in front of the counseling office. This is my last ADHD appointment. I'm familiar with mental health services in San Antonio. I'm familiar with ADHD diagnosis in general. I'm familiar with, best practice medications and counseling services and school therapies and all these things. And it's so hard to fucking figure out and get people to listen to you, and it's so expensive. Oh my god. God forbid I was a 26-year-old mom who didn't have this knowledge, who had a kid. I was reading on the internet this idea that people with anxiety and people with ADHD, or people with anxiety and ADHD, have this issue where your anxiety operates to counteract your executive dysfunction. Like, if your thought process is, if I don't complete this, I will die, familiar thought for me, then you will find a way, you will find the motivation, you will find the emotional coping mechanisms needed to make sure that you're able to get your schoolwork done. And sometimes what happens is, when you start getting treatment for your anxiety, i.e. taking an antidepressant that works for anxiety, or receiving therapy that starts making a difference, when that anxiety stops controlling you, you don't know how to counteract executive dysfunction without it. That has been 100% my experience the past 6 months. So being in graduate school really changed the game about what I was willing to put up with as a student, and what I wanted myself to be as a student, and how hard I wanted to work versus how able I wanted to be. I was just tired of it being so hard, and I was realizing that it doesn't have to, not just that it doesn't have to be so hard, but that I would never put up with this for a student of mine. I would never say, oh, that's fine, honey, you're doing great, just work harder. I had a lot of teachers who did that to me. I had a lot of teachers who were like, you're intelligent and you get mediocre good grades, and you don't cry in my classroom, so sounds like you're doing great. And I would hope that I would never do that to I mean, it's not that easy, but I would hope I would never do that to a student.
I bring you a carnation from the center of the universe, and even though I've never been Out of all my friends, I'd pick you first. And I'd hope the ringing of
We were talking about something, and she said, "Oh, we were talking about our body images, and like how you're just never really satisfied. How neither one of us have ever really been satisfied about how we look." And like looking back at how I looked 10 years ago, I'm like, oh my God, that woman was so hot. Like, why did I not own that then? You know? And she's like, well, when we're in our 60s, we're gonna be like, man, you remember when we were in our 40s, and you know. And she said, I don't understand what you're feeling self-conscious about. You have a girlfriend and a boyfriend. And it was like, even like just her saying that, it's like, huh, like sometimes I'm like, in my mind, I'm not queer. Like in my, like, this isn't weird. Like, this isn't non-traditional. This isn't queer. Like, oh yeah, I like girls and boys, but like, oh, that's right, we have a term for that. Like, that's the thing. I get to say, I get to claim the bi and the Q. Like, woo, you know? I think like the self-labeling is like uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable for you.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. That's a conversation we had in class because we've been talking about labeling oneself as white
Mm-hmm.
as something that white people can avoid successfully.
Yeah.
We've been talking about labels in general, like this idea of like claiming a label is a big deal for some people and is a heavy weight for other people, like interestingly. And not even necessarily on like racial or heteronormative lines,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes like that is why, right? Like you might be used to being unlabelable as a white woman, right? Like I am normal, I am average.
Right. The normal.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So suddenly to have a label is foreign to you, whereas a queer Latina is used to having a lot of labels put on her all the time, and like, what's one more? Whatever.
That's really interesting.
This is tangential.
Yeah, not part.
Yeah.
But that's such an interesting thought. Like maybe it is just what you said, like growing up being used to carrying labels or not, and so like your comfort level with them, and that might be why it's strange to me.
Like the only labels you would have had would be like AP student or
Yes.
something like that. And so this might be the first time that you're carrying a label that if you share it with someone else, you don't know what that was.
It could cause me harm. It could be like exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Well, that just had to be like we always like our life was unusual. I think having just being in a musician artist house and being part of a hippie school, like those things are like they have an inherent awkwardness already that you could cope queer. But I don't think I was so nervous about being accepted for my sexuality from my children. I think I was more nervous about a change to our household. I think I was worried about that, like the impacts of bringing in an entire different family into our life felt like a lot. And I think out of the 3 kids, you were like the most accepting, the most quickly to everything. That's very sweet, but I don't think that it. I don't know. You would have to ask your siblings if they felt like they lost anything, or if they. I don't know.
Do you identify as queer?
I guess so. Only because when I started this relationship that I'm in now, it had to have a definition.
Why?
Well, it didn't have to have a definition, but
You successfully didn't define it for a good like year. We're very,
well, it had to have a definition because it didn't fall under traditional definitions. It's not the definition of a traditional relationship.
You had to have a word to explain it.
Yeah, and so the easiest umbrella, the top umbrella would be queer, just different than normal.
When you would call from his phone.
Yeah.
But this is
I've
working.
been recording a book that I'm reading is a lot of like shorts, and they're all based around like different living things.
Uh-huh.
So, like the title of it will be like the name of whatever it is, like narwhal, and then its scientific name, and then it's reflections on this woman's like experience of growing up in America as being a mix of like East Asian. Our parents were two different East Asian cultures, and just like these different pieces, but it's really beautiful. And your mom was laughing at me because she was like, "That's so dorky." And I was like, "I find it really soothing. Like, I really like the passages, and then I'm recording them, and it's helping me and giving me an insight for talking with teachers about a pet peeve, which is when teachers say, like, I'm pronouncing this right, or butcher things in story, because I feel like that's part of your responsibility as the storyteller.
Is to, like, figure out how to do that correctly before you
to-
start telling the story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Like,
Yeah.
that's your homework. You need to do that.
That's like, okay, this is not this topic of the conversation, but I've really been digging into this idea of, like, that first level of cultural and racial responsiveness being, like, folklore and fairy tales, which is, like, what we've been doing for decades, and it's a great first level, but we're already on, like, level 4 in the way that we talk about, like, race and, like, multiculturalism. It's a little frustrating.
I agree. We've definitely moved above and beyond that. Come on, y'all.
Let's pick up the pace. You can keep your stories, but let's do the next level too. How do you square wanting knuckle tats with not wanting people to think you're a stereotypical Mexican?
Well, first of all, that's not what knuckle tats represent anymore.
Oh?
No, not when your pharmacist has them, and
Whose pharmacist has knuckle tats? Your pharmacist here on the south side?
it's gonna come off really Mexican, but I think it's become more of just self-expression than anything.
That's just how you see tattoos.
Or I would reject it.
Yeah. I think that's what's interesting to me is you it's not that you don't do things to avoid stereotype.
Right.
You just don't care about this one.
Yeah.
You're making a choice about this.
That's right.
This one.
Doesn't bother me.
Okay.
I'm not gonna wear a sombrero to a gig.
You're just gonna wear your cowboy hat that has the front eaten out of it?
Yeah. That's appropriation. That's funny. I don't know why I'm so against, because I say it as a joke, but Mexican culture, it's not just Mexican culture. I think it's perpetuating stereotypes. Not like when you perpetuate a stereotype in your life, when you become the lazy, uneducated person, and then you want to celebrate it by dressing like that, that's a bit much. Like I just.
Well, okay, who do you know dresses like that?
Well, in my field, it's a real thing. It's big in the in literary culture, where you have to. That's the only way to present yourself, right? Because you're not on stage, and you have to exaggerate your.
What, wearing like a carpet on your
Yes.
with a belt?
Yeah, carpet with a belt. I don't want to read what you have to say.
But that isn't where it ends for you. That's where it starts, maybe, is like not wanting to be a guy with a carpet and a belt, but it's deeper than that.
Right, because it is deeper than that, because my culture has has an arrested development. You know, it's really stuck in a place. I don't know.
We almost have to like give this like normal part of human experience a name to formalize it, to legitimize it in an academic setting, you know, like the same is true, like anthropology, archaeology. There's this weight that's put on the written word.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, history is you're studying cultures that have writing. Like, that's the definition of history. Prehistory is pre-writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's the same kind of funny to me that it was revolutionary when, like, just a generation of academics ago, people started recording and paying attention to oral history.
Mm-hmm.
So, for cultures that, didn't have or don't have a written language, or did and it was largely destroyed. Like, if you think about the Maya, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they wrote that there are 3 or 4 codices that have anything remaining, right? Everything else is burned. So there's no way for somebody who's wanting to go study the Maya. People used to say, well, there's just no way to know what they would say about themselves, until it was like, oh, hey, like, there's this group of people that still self-identify as Maya. Like, maybe we should just go talk to them and hear about the stories that they tell about themselves. And, like, somebody could write those down, and then...
Thank you, Susha. You did great.
Which one?
And then what you boss you to do.
Means that you know what you're doing in your class, right?
It might also mean you have control issues, but that's okay too.
Yeah, a table full of strong women all agree.